The New World in the early 1800s was rife with potential. The US was a rising star since its constitutional reforms in the 1790s, and it had quickly grown to the bounds of the Mississippi River. Brazil was the largest country in the Americas and had an impressive standard of living and vibrant political scene. Gran Columbia was seen as a prosperous Republican experiment, despite falling apart shortly into the 1830s. But perhaps few countries in the era had as much potential as Mexico. While they didn't know it at the time, their initial borders had claims all over some of the most lucrative oil and gold deposits left to exploit in the Americas, as well as immense agricultural wealth that could have easily translated into a rival for the burgeoning United States. However, economic stratification during the colonial era, lackluster governments, and a disastrous series of revolts throughout the period saw Mexico reduced in prestige, stability, and power. But this, of course, begs the question, what if it didn't? What if it had remained a credible rival to the US and challenger to the Europeans? In short, what if Mexico was a superpower? Now, the best way to set Mexico up for success would be to go back to nearly the founding of New Spain after the conquest of the Aztec Empire and play with the peninsular-centric policies and have it be looted less. But that would fundamentally reshape everything going forward, so we're going to stick to later points of divergence. We will start in the 1700s with the Bourbon reforms, which greatly liberalized trade within the Spanish Empire, but this was in service of restoring Spanish primacy over its colonies, and generally failed at that. We're going to scrap the implementation of itinerants, which centralized the administration in the hands of Spanish-born nobles who were focused in the cities. Instead, the Bourbons will focus on the colonial-born white population for this goal. We also need to increase access to education. While the US certainly didn't have a public education system at the time of independence, most states and religious elements in society did emphasize literacy to some degree. Thus, if the local Jesuits are in a position to create these same elements, Mexico will generally be set up better than in real life. And this is a very severe problem that we need to fix. While this is far outside the time frame we're messing with here, in 1910, Mexico's population was about 15 million. Of that, over 11 million were illiterate. Needless to say, the sooner that we get some level of accessible education, the better off we'll be. Now, I can't find any resolute stats about literacy during the American Revolution. Some stuff about signatures on wills and whatnot, but that's a very, very low bar. But it seems that the majority of New England's white male population had at least some rudimentary education. Thus, we'll say that our goal is for Mexico to be about 40 to 50% literate at the time of full independence, since we are starting these reforms later than the American colonies. I know we're spending a good bit of time on these details of government, but I'm doing it for a reason. Firstly, I think that we can agree that stable politics are generally good for economic growth and attracting immigrants. If we want to make Mexico a superpower, we need to stabilize the country and economics and bolster that population. And for some context on how messy Mexico's 19th century was, the first census in the country was in the 1890s. That is 20 years after the first national census in Brazil, and the US started doing it as soon as 1790. The central government was just that unstable. Regardless, that census showed that Mexico had about 12 million people. The US hit that metric in 1830, by the way, meaning that we need the stability to attract a lot of people. But we also need Mexico to achieve independence from Spain, so how are we doing that? Well, to start, we're going to focus on the Creole elements in New Spain. Catholic priest Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla launched the first independence revolt, calling for a constitutional government that was in personal union with Ferdinand VI, who early revolutionaries recognized as king. And herein lies our first serious problem, because Ferdinand is never going to accept a constitutional limit on his power or Mexican independence. Nothing we do for this revolt, including having them take Mexico City, will allow the conservative and absolutist King Ferdinand to humor them. However, much of Hidalgo's support came from peasants who were very loyal to Ferdinand VI. Monarchy does seem to have been the consensus among the revolutionaries until Ferdinand abolished the Spanish Constitution in 1815, and even then there was still a lot of debate on it and monarchist sentiment. So, we need to have Ferdinand denounce the Constitution of 1812 much sooner and attack those seeking autonomy. This will at least hopefully force the revolutionaries to turn towards outside houses for their monarchs, or elect one of their own like they did with Augustin de Ibertud. The war will likely still rage for quite some time, and Spain won't necessarily ratify the treaty quickly, but still. After declaring independence under a Regency Council in 1812 or 1813, Mexico wins the war, at least de facto, by the 1820s, about the same as in real life. Now, you could make the argument that a more literate Mexican population is less likely to adopt monarchism, since few countries have really gone that route, especially in more educated societies. But again, I do want to keep this at least somewhat recognizable to our Mexico. And I'm sorry to keep being all nitty-gritty, but we also need to mess with the early constitution. We'll keep Augustin or someone like him so the Mexican Empire sticks around, but we do need to define the powers of the monarchy, since failure to do so led to instability and disunity. The main questions were a royal veto and him appointing members of the Supreme Court. Congress dragged their feet on a proper constitution, so Augustus tried to govern in accordance to the Spanish Constitution of 1812, which Congress believed was illegitimate. This led to him disbanding Congress and ruling by decree, which resulted in the creation of the First Republic. But this also led to revolts in Central America, the taking of major loans from Britain, and the instability that allowed Santa Anna to come to power. We need Mexico to have more stable politics, meaning either Augustin doesn't dissolve Congress and accept some limits on his power, or the Republic is able to avoid the debt crisis by not taking on the debts of New Spain, and more reasonable tariffs to avoid the problems with Central America. Now, one of the big debates in early Mexican politics was centralization versus federalism. There were also debates about the role of Catholicism and clericalism, but seeing as the Jesuits and the Church are currently propping up Mexican education, I'm going to assume the conservatives win that particular debate. Now, in real life, Mexico adopted a more federal model and chose relatively secular government. It seems plausible to me that conservatives would be emboldened, meaning that centralization stands a better chance. Corporatism would later emerge in the 1840s, but we've pretty drastically changed Mexican politics already, so I'm more or less going to ignore that question just for the sake of my sanity. Alright, so 1200 words in, we've mostly fixed Mexico. In this world's 1830s, it's got a more stable democratic government, which is able to more seriously invest in the literacy of the country and attracts immigrants, which bolsters the population. It's probably still only at about 9 million versus the 12 million that the US has, but it's attracting more Catholic immigration comparatively, which is helping out a lot. But now we need to deal with Texas in the room. In the 1820s, Mexico drastically lowered the caps on immigration and settlement in the northern frontier, which led to Americans flooding eastern Texas, eventually culminating in a revolt. More about that here. This exacerbated tensions with the US, who really wanted California, and led to the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. Mexico did not do well, but thankfully we've probably put them in a better position to crush a potential revolt in Texas. Or even better, the revolt never happens because the region's Tejanos and European immigrants are more loyal to Mexico than the US. Now, this has huge consequences for the US. Colonization of the West is slower and less partisan. Expansionism will likely be funneled north into Canada, which could be a mess, and into the Caribbean. In my Texas video, I mentioned the US probably bullies Spain into forking over Cuba, for example. Now, a few people on the poll that led to this video mentioned the idea that the US would have to be fucked over in order to make this scenario work. And while that would certainly be easier, it would also be boring. Even after the acquisition of Cuba, I think that a Mexican-American war could happen. Big, powerful states don't generally like having other big, powerful states next to them. See these two. Or these two, or these three, actually. The war would likely be later, somewhere around 1852, and even if the US wins, the victories will be very modest. Bits like Northern California and like eastern Texas. This eastern frontier will be prominent. However, the US isn't the only rival that Mexico has to contend with. See, while Napoleon III was the one who wanted France to outright colonize Mexico, the two countries had tensions all the way back to the 1830s, when political instability led to the destruction of French property. Known as the Pastry War, France would blockade Mexico until Britain mediated. We'll actually keep this around, largely because it forces Mexico to begin major naval expansion. This naval development throughout the 1840s and 1850s would increase tensions with the US and be very expensive. Thankfully, this is about when the California gold rush started. This region will become a major target for settlement by both Mexicans, immigrants, and hopeful American filibusters. After the first Mexican-American War, tensions between the two states will be high, but another war is unlikely before 1860. Sorry for the very quick interruption, but if you're enjoying the video so far, please consider like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and it helps you stay notified of future videos like this. We're closing in on 2,000 subscribers, and it would mean the world if you helped push us over that line. Now let's get back to the show. However, more important questions arise at this point. Namely, does the Civil War happen in the States, and does France invade Mexico? For the first, I'm inclined to say it's plausible. Even with Cuba and other Caribbean territories, the Senate balance is still unfavorable to the South. Now, the Union likely wins even so, but it does mean that the US probably isn't willing to deal with Mexico during the immediate aftermath. However, Mexico has its own problems. France at this time was enamored by the idea of a new empire in the Americas. Even if in this timeline Mexico is seen as too powerful for France to invade, I think that Paris would want something. Personally, I think that Venezuela or Colombia would be a likely choice. It probably needs to be somewhere with an Atlantic coast. Brazil is utterly massive and probably can't easily be subjugated by force, and Argentina isn't really worth it. I'm sorry, Argentinians. That leaves these two or the Caribbean. However, in this timeline, France isn't invading a civil war-racked and debt-shackled country with few friends whose primary guarantor is fighting their own civil war. They're invading a civil war-racked country that's probably debt-shackled, but this time there's a rival power actually able to contest the invasion from the outset. Whatever Mexico's relationship is with Venezuela at this point, they'd prefer that to a French puppet. Thus, the French invasion is met with an ultimatum by Mexico: withdraw or face war. France, being France, does not blink. Mexico, however, has been building a fleet since the Pastry War precisely to protect against France. It doesn't need to be the most powerful fleet in the world, since France still needs its navy all over the planet, while Mexico can focus on the Gulf. As a result, the 1860s are the emergence of Mexico as an actual credible naval power, at least in their arena. While France might actually be able to conquer Venezuela, or at least crush the government, reinforcing the invasion will be much more difficult than in real life, and it's not like they had the best logistics in our timeline. While Mexico probably doesn't have the Monroe Doctrine, the message is clear. The Americas are part of their sphere of influence, at least for now. This war will be even more expensive for France, and it will likely cause greater tensions politically. As a result, whatever government emerged in 1848 will be even more unstable in the lead up to the Franco-Prussian War. As a result, Prussia still wins that conflict, and now there's a Germany. We'll come back to them later, though. Come the 1870s or 1880s, I think that tensions will mount between the US and Mexico again. California would probably still have a lot of Anglo-Protestant settlers, since the gold rush was utterly massive, and Mexico, being a Catholic Hispanic country, would probably want to assimilate them. In our world, the post-Civil War US was keen to expand into Asia and diplomatically control Latin America in order to reinvigorate a united sense of nationalism, which would likely happen here, except this time, they have a credible rival in a much smaller Pacific coast. As a result, I'd imagine that there'd be a new claim to the rest of California or Texas based on the persecution of the Anglo-Protestant community, and a second Mexican-American War kicks off around 1876 or 1881. While this might seem a little extreme, since Mexico just got out of a war with France, they are still the defenders in this situation. However, this time, Mexico is in a very good position. They would have reached relative parity with the US in terms of population, economics, and have a strong navy. The Gulf will likely be a fucking bloodbath between the two powers, and the war will be far from short. The deciding factors will be the logistics of the California and Texas fronts, which could go either way. Realistically, both of them will struggle because both the US and Mexico have major mountain ranges that impede the military efficacy of their railroads, and the amount of naval battles going on between each side will only hinder their maritime logistics. If the US has Cuba or other Caribbean territories or states, I would fully expect them to be under near constant threat of invasion by the Mexican army, almost more so than places like Louisiana, since that front will be back and forth for a while. But the point of the video is Mexico being a superpower, obviously they'll win the day in the long run. This treaty is much harsher than this timeline's Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was. Mexico will almost certainly take back eastern Texas and the American piece of California, possibly deporting the American settlers in the region in order to minimize the Union's claim. Bits and pieces of Oklahoma and other frontier areas will likely be on the chopping block as well. Mexico needs a major buffer because even though the country is hilly and mountainous, the eastern shore is relatively flat, which combined with the American Texas to create a level of vulnerability. In addition, there will absolutely be financial obligations and other punitive measures leveled at the Union. Probably nothing catastrophic, but a war indemnity to cover rebuilding Mexico and preparing the defenses for a hypothetical other war would be a major goal of the administration. The US will be humiliated by this defeat. This isn't some status quo antebellum or whatever like the War of 1812 was, where they can pretend they won, or a war with a Native American society that they can just invade again in a few years when smallpox has done half the work. This is proof that they aren't hegemons of the continent in the way that they've always presented themselves. They have a very credible rivalry with Mexico in this world, again to Britain and Germany. Neither of them can easily crush the other, which, if anything, just makes the anger worse. I would fully expect the US becomes extremely anti-Hispanic in this world, an unfortunate turn of events for any states it might have in the Caribbean like Cuba and Puerto Rico. Similarly, the economy likely enters a bit of a low period due to the burdens of a long war and financial obligations to Mexico. Plus, the US will just be poorer than it was in our world as a direct result of not having the Southwest. It might still have Alaska, which would just make the borders look ridiculous, but that gold rush was later and not as extreme as the one in California. As a result, the mid-1880s are not a fun time for the US, and they're probably very angry. Much like another nation I know who suffered a humiliating defeat around this time who has poor relations with Mexico. In contrast, Mexico will be riding very high. They've secured themselves as a major power against France of all countries, earning them quite a bit of diplomatic clout. Then they turned around and beat back the US, reversing the relatively minor losses of the 1850s. Leaving them very nationalistic, and the economy will be doing very well. They'll have gotten quite a few concessions from Venezuela due to propping up the current government, as well as the war indemnity from the US. As a whole, I would imagine the 1880s to 1890s of Mexico being seen like an early version of the Roaring Twenties, wartime victories and economic booms, while also being a time of cultural liberalization due to veterans wanting change and early calls for minority rights. However, it will certainly have a lot of elements of the Gilded Age as industry runs rampant and labor agitations are prominent. Now, before we get to the Great War, we should talk about the Pacific. The US was meddling in the area as early as the 1840s with the Paulette Affair when a British captain took over Hawaii and made a mess of things. Come the 1850s, they would even open up Japan, and of course, around the 1890s, took over the Philippines and took Hawaii for themselves. That being said, now they have a much smaller Pacific coast, and another major rivalry. The US, UK, France, Mexico, Russia, and later Germany will all be competing for control over the Pacific as early as the 1850s. Hawaii is likely a major flashpoint between the US, UK, and Mexico. Given the lack of a California, I want to give the edge to Britain, all things considered. The region is likely just a protectorate and probably isn't settled as intensely as the Americans did, but it is readily exploited under near slave conditions for sugar and other cash crops, because it's still Britain. The Philippines are likely the last vestiges of the Spanish Empire come the 1880s or 1890s, since the US in the 1840s wouldn't have had any major interest in the colony. But Japan's in a very different situation. The divergent states likely mean that Millard Fillmore never becomes president to order Commodore Perry to open Japan up. In contrast, Mexico is in a prime position to do so, but has little reason to. While they might be enticed by the same prestige and expansionism as well as whaling that motivated the move, it would also be very convergent even by my standards to assume as such. So what happens to Japan? Well, I don't think it gets colonized in full or anything, since such sweeping conquests in Asia were kind of rare. But I do think that it ends up being at least under the sphere of influence of conflicting European powers. Silver was one of Japan's major resources, and incidentally was one of the main things that Europeans traded with China. As a result, France, Britain, and Germany are all going to want to weasel their way in. I could easily see Germany or France trying to bully their way into opening the country, creating a bit of a scramble for the area. And here's my entirely arbitrary map of what that comes to look like. For the sake of things, Britain is the one who actually bullies their way in and takes most of the island of Kyushu and parts of Honshu. Korea is likely bullied into the Russian sphere of influence, or is de facto partitioned between them and Britain. Now, interestingly, I think that Mexico could be an ally of the Germans in this time. Normally, I think that German expansionism in the Caribbean and Pacific would stop their attempts to win over many allies in the Americas. But this timeline is different. Firstly, the Franco-Mexican rivalry has been an overarching element of the 19th century, with war in the 1860s and the Pastry War, meaning that they're already going to sympathize more with Germany than the French. Secondly, the German expansionism that I refer to can't happen in this timeline. The Venezuela War would drastically change the political history of the country, and the odds of them being in the same debt to the same powers are slim to none, and that was one of the first and largest incidents. In addition, while Mexico and Germany might have some conflict in the Pacific, we have a stronger precedent for it being between them and America because of the Samoa crisis. So, in 1914, or whenever the Europeans come to blows, the American Titans start off as neutral, but America favors the Entente due to trade relations with them, similar values, and the fact that Mexico likes Germany. Mexico's ties to Berlin are less about Berlin specifically, and more due to a greater sense of rivalry with the powers that make up the forces of the Entente, converging interests. However, as the war drags on, the empires get desperate. The Germans declare unrestricted submarine warfare around the United Kingdom, including attacks on neutral ships. However, they make the conscious and biased decision not to attack Mexican ships to the continent, but keep that as hidden as they can. This angers the Americans, but they aren't ready to start a war yet, and Germany backs down after an incident like the Lusitania. Britain, however, notices that Mexican ships aren't getting blasted in the channel, and begins ordering their ships to search any Mexican ones going to the continent, even those destined for neutral ports like the Netherlands. Mexico is incensed, but also doesn't do anything about it from 1914 to 1915. But come 1916, as the Russians are struggling, Britain gets desperate and orders that all Mexican ships heading to Denmark, the Netherlands, and even Norway be stopped. From Britain's perspective, they need to starve Germany out now. This is a blatant attack on Mexican sovereignty, and they declare war. They mobilize the Armada and quickly take hold of any Entente colonies in the Caribbean. They're more or less undefended due to the need to protect the homeland. Germany quietly restarts unrestricted submarine warfare in the meantime, which eventually draws the US in around 1917. However, now they are forced to prepare for round 3 with Mexico, and this is going to be the big one. As both sides amass the largest armies North America has ever seen, things get bad. The war will be more mobile than the European counterpart just due to the size of the fronts, but there will still be parts of Texas or Oregon ravaged by trench warfare, while other parts are destroyed by even more mobile industrial warfare. The conflict around the eastern border is like the Western Front on steroids. Whoever winds up on the defense is in for a very rough time. I would suspect that would be the Americans, since Mexico has already mobilized an army to deal with the Franco-British colonies in the area. In addition, the border around California or Oregon might be even worse, because that area is hilly and mountainous. The Klamath Mountains in Northern California are about 9,000 feet or so, and are sparsely populated even today. That area will be like the Balkan or even Romanian fronts, but between peer armies, not the great power of Austria-Hungary and Romania. The battles will be utter hell on earth with no respite at the ends of the logistic chains. I don't even want to think about the front in the Rocky Mountains proper. That shit would be fighting in the honest-to-God Alps. And of course, the US entering the war means a proper naval front in the Gulf, but I have no idea how that could possibly go. Oh, and the best part is these two will be able to keep it going a lot longer than the Europeans. They would grow most of their own food, and while Texas is under siege, the most fertile parts of the state are a bit inland from the border. The Californian agricultural fields are nowhere near the conflict, not to mention Mexico's agricultural land of our timeline. Same for the Great Plains and the Midwest for the Americans. This is effectively if both the Entente and Central Powers had an America, and having the two American giants fighting each other will have problems for the Europeans as well. The Germans are probably able to beat the Russians and reinforce the Western Front. Hell, they probably don't even need to launch the summer offensive. While America is arming the Entente very nicely, they can't send more than a token force without undermining their own massive front line. But Austria is collapsing under the weight of the revolts and at least some pressure from the Entente, and Mexico can't sneak food into Berlin any more than the Americans can reinforce the Brits. Meaning that Germany still needs to whip Ukraine into actual stability so that it can eat, and send at least a good chunk of its army down to Austria-Hungary to stabilize the front. I could easily see this version of World War I lasting over 5 years rather than 4. Oh, and to top it all off, Japan will likely see conflict as well. It was de facto partition between Britain, France, and Germany, remember? The Brits probably win that front since Germany can't really support any troops it might have. I won't really comment on the Japanese front since it's kind of tertiary compared to the European and American theaters, but yeah, Japan's catching strays on this timeline. So which side breaks first? Well, honestly, even if France falls, Britain can hold out for a while. With the USN and Mexican Armada distracting each other, British naval supremacy is maintained and they can lean on the Empire to feed themselves for longer, while Germany still needs to stabilize Eastern Europe to even have that kind of time. But because Mexico is the protagonist of the video, we'll say that Germany is able to barely prop up Ukraine enough to feed the Kaiserreich, while Austria's collapse is mitigated by a German-Italian ceasefire. Without more American soldiers to aid them, France falls in late 1919, with Britain agreeing to make peace in early 1920. The Third Mexican-American War likely goes on for a few more months before peace arrives here as well. This would be their third year of fighting. America, alone against the world, requests terms. The end of the Great War is a messy affair. Germany has stabilized at least some of its sphere of influence and is able to kneecap France, but it can't touch Britain, and has no wiggle room to demand its colonies back. Germany is probably on the brink of revolution itself, with Marxists marching in the streets and the food situation barely stabilizing. Austria has collapsed into revolts, leaving Italy and Serbia to work out its fate among themselves. In the American front, Mexico likely creates client states out of the British and French colonies it took in the area. The US, drained after 3 years of fighting its main rival, is seeing massive protests from its minorities and agitation from all social classes. Depending on how the Gulf front went, Mexico likely rips Cuba and Hispaniola out as sister republics. If we want to make it radical, they could even turn the state of Louisiana into a Republic of New Africa and demilitarize places like Arkansas. And of course, level military restrictions against the US for a while. This is obviously a radical treaty, especially since the US is in a better position than France was in this timeline or Germany was in ours, but without any allies and the Central Powers watching, it might almost happen. Needless to say, this is a disaster for the US, and it may even face revolution, though that is incredibly unlikely. The 1920s will be a wave of unstable politics, and the federal government can't do anything about it. Black Americans will be persecuted even more than they already were, and Latinos will be public enemy number 1, meaning that those who fled the Mexicans taking over their home islands will be in for a real rough time. The US isn't damaged too badly in a material way, but its psyche is hit very hard by this conflict. Also, the economy is obviously in ruins from many financial obligations, and spike in unemployment from demobilization. Now, Mexico probably isn't doing so hot either. It's demobilizing one of the largest armies and navies in the world, has to rebuild massive parts of North America, and the Germans are begging for financial aid from both them and the Americans. However, it also comes out of the war the single most powerful nation on the planet, its competitors being the broke British and Germans who have barely established any global reach. I would fully expect there to be massive calls for reform. Socialist unrest will be very common throughout the era, likely challenging liberals and conservatives for their spot, similar to the decline of the Liberal Party in Britain. Worldwide economic dynamics are incredibly divergent from our timeline at this point for obvious reasons, and I'm not sure that the US or Mexico would have the financial power over the Europeans that the US achieved in our timeline, making it impossible to speculate on a potential Great Depression. With that, I think I need to end the video here. After stabilizing early politics and its economy, Mexico was able to claim its great frontier in the north. That afforded it the means to contain the Americans and beat back the French, while setting them on a course to align with the Germans. After 3 brutal wars with the US, they finally, and hopefully fully, eclipsed DC and are the most powerful nation in the world. Before we go, I want to thank channel members like Peter Darker, Trey, Now Fumato, Grimwalt, and Dubsmain for their support, and an extra special thank you to Peter Darker, Trey, Grimwalt, and Dubsmain for joining at the exclamation point level. Thank you so much for watching, and join me next week as we explore another alternate world.